Does painting a full landscape feel like juggling too many balls at once? You're worried about perspective, then color harmony, then lighting, and suddenly, it's just a mess. I get it. That's why today, we're not just drawing a scene. We're building a reliable workflow. I'll walk you through my exact process for creating a forest cottage scene in Clip Studio Paint, from the first rough sketch to the final light and shadow. We'll cover how to block values without getting stuck, how to use texture brushes to save time, and how to make sure your focal point actually pops. No pro secrets, just a clear step-by-step path to finishing what you start. And to keep that path as clear as possible, we're doing this entirely in Clip Studio Paint Simple Mode. Speaking of which, huge thanks to Clip Studio Paint for sponsoring this video. I really love how Simple Mode keeps the workspace calm. It lets me focus on drawing instead of digging through toolbars. With easy undo, quick layer toggles, and minimal brushes, there's less fiddling and more learning. If you're just starting out, it's a gentle, low-pressure way to explore digital art. Let's move into composition. For this demo, we're keeping the scene simple. Something deep in the forest, maybe a waterfall in the background, and a small cottage or hut as the main focal point. Just enough to practice the workflow without getting overwhelmed. You can start with a quick, rough sketch to get a feel for the layout. It's tempting to zoom in immediately, but I tend to keep my canvas zoomed out while I work, just because it stops me from obsessing over clean lines too early. It's not a rule or anything, but I find it helps me focus on the overall composition and see the whole picture early on. For the sketch, I'm using the default felt pen tool. Before starting, having a reference makes this step much easier. I'll drop my idea collage into the app to guide the sketch. It won't be an exact copy, but it helps keep the elements grounded and consistent. While blocking in the shapes, I'm placing the horizon line low in the bottom half of the frame. This leaves the upper 2/3 open for background details like the waterfall and sky. It's a simple trick to create depth and keep the composition from feeling too tight. As the sketch takes shape, don't stress over perfection. We can clean it up later. Remember, nature is organic. It's built on curves and imperfections. Unlike the cottage, which needs straight, rigid lines to look structural, the trees and rocks actually benefit from being loose and irregular. Once I'm happy with the rough sketch, I'm adding a new layer to block in my values. To make sure the sketch doesn't get in the way, I'll switch that layer to multiply and drop the opacity. Now the lines are subtle, giving us a clean slate to focus on light and shadow while still having our composition as a reference. We'll block in our values using only desaturated colors, essentially painting with black, white, and gray. This forces us to focus on contrast and form first, ensuring our lighting works before we add color. As we do this, think of dividing the scene into 3 basic zones: background, middle ground, and foreground. The goal is to establish depth by keeping these layers distinct so the image doesn't feel flat. When laying out values to build depth, it helps to look at real-life references. Notice how things farther away appear lighter and softer? That's due to a natural pattern called atmospheric perspective, caused by the air between us and distant objects. If we strip away the color, you can see this pattern even more clearly. We'll use this same logic to block in our own scene. For this blocking stage, I'm using a solid brush with hard edges, like this square texture brush. This helps us focus on big, clear shapes rather than getting lost in soft blending too early. So, I'll keep the background light, push the middle ground where the cottage sits into midtones, and use the darkest values in the foreground. This separation creates distinct layers, giving the scene immediate depth and making it easy to read. Remember, this stage doesn't need to be polished. Think of it as a lighting map rather than a finished painting. We're ignoring local color for now, meaning we aren't worrying about whether a tree is green or brown. Instead, we're focusing purely on where the light hits and where the shadows fall. This gives us a solid foundation for our lighting before we get distracted by colors. Once I'm happy with the composition, I'll organize my layers to keep things tidy. First, I'll group all the value blocking layers into a single folder, but I'll leave the rough sketch layer outside and on top. Next, I'll create a new main folder named Flat Colors above everything. Inside this folder, I'll add 3 separate layers, one for the background, one for the middle ground, and one for the foreground. To keep my view clean, I'll also hide the composition folder for now. Finally, I'll lower the opacity of the rough sketch layer so it's just faint enough to guide us without getting in the way. It might feel like extra steps, but this setup makes adjusting values and colors later so much easier. Now that our layers are set up, let's lay out our flat colors. I'm actually starting with the foreground first. Since it takes up more space and acts like a frame for the rest of the scene, it helps me gauge how to place the background elements later. As I pick my colors, I'm already thinking about shadows. For the foreground, I'm choosing darker values right from the start because I know this area will be in shade. To keep things simple, I'm sticking to natural hues, but keeping the saturation low. This keeps the colors harmonious, leaving room to turn up the volume later where it matters. But before I paint too much, I've organized my layers to make this easier. Inside the flat colors folder, I created a specific folder for the foreground and added separate layers for overlapping elements like trees and bushes. This way, I can block in each shape without worrying about accidentally painting over parts I've already finished. To avoid flat, boring colors, I'll add some subtle color notes. Here's the trick. Pick a slightly different hue or temperature, lower the brush opacity, and lightly swipe it across the base color. Then, use the eyedropper to pick that new blended tone. This gives you a rich, varied color without changing the value too much, keeping your lighting consistent. I'm just finishing up the foreground now. For some of these elements, like the bushes and tree bark, I'm switching to textured brushes. This makes it much easier to build form and add visual interest quickly, without having to manually paint every single leaf or detail. It gives us that organic, rough look we want for the forest while saving a lot of time. Moving on to the middle ground, I wasn't entirely happy with the cottage shape in my rough sketch, so I experimented with a few different forms until I found one I preferred. Because the cottage is geometric, unlike the organic trees and rocks around it, any slight error in perspective stands out immediately. To ensure accuracy, I switched to studio mode and added a perspective ruler layer. This gives me precise guides for the walls and roof, ensuring the structure looks solid and believable within the scene. The key here is to match the ruler's horizon line to the one we established in our rough sketch. I'll quickly sketch the new form of the cottage and then adjust the vanishing points so they approximately line up with my drawing. Keep in mind, it won't be a perfect match, since our hand-drawn sketch isn't mathematically accurate, but it gives us the right gist and structure. Once the perspective feels solid, I'll create a clean, rough linear art layer on top. This will serve as our precise guide for color blocking, ensuring the cottage looks structured and believable. Once the structure is locked in, I'll switch back to simple mode. I'll also lower the sketch's opacity, so it acts as a subtle guide for placing the colors, rather than distracting from them. Going back to color blocking the middle ground, the process is essentially the same as the foreground. But here's the key difference. I'm treating these elements as if they're in direct light. Since the cottage is our focal point, I want it to stand out. That means most of this area will be brightly lit, with fewer deep shadows compared to the foreground. To really make the focal point pop, I'm also using warmer colors here. This creates a strong contrast against the cooler tones of the surrounding forest, naturally drawing the viewer's eye right to the cottage. For the background, the process is similar, but with one major shift: the values are much lighter. Remember that atmospheric perspective we talked about? To sell that sense of distance, I'm keeping the forms here soft and hazy. Instead of sharp edges, like in the foreground, the trees and mountains blend slightly into the atmosphere. This lack of structure tells the viewer's brain this is far away, which adds incredible depth to the scene. Now that all three visual planes are colored, there's one step I like to do before adding lights and shadows: harmonizing the overall color tone. You could adjust every single layer individually, but that takes forever. Instead, here's a safer workflow. I'll make a copy of each plane folder and hide the originals. This way, we keep our separate layers safe just in case we need them later. Then, on these new copies, I merge the layers within each folder, so I have just one single layer for the foreground, one for the middle ground, and one for the background. This makes it much easier to tweak the hue or saturation of each plane as a whole. It gives me better control over how light or dark each section feels, ensuring they all work together harmoniously before we start rendering. Next, I'll apply a color adjustment filter to each merged layer and tweak the settings until I'm satisfied. For this piece, I focused on making the foreground and background slightly cooler. By pushing these outer planes toward blue or cyan tones, they recede visually, which naturally creates more emphasis on the middle ground. Since the cottage sits in that warmer, mid-tone zone, it stands out even more against the cool surroundings. With our colors harmonized and the planes balanced, we're finally ready for the most transformative step: adding lights and shadows. Up until now, everything has been flat. But by introducing light sources and shadows, we'll give these shapes volume, depth, and life. Again, I'll start by duplicating the flat colors folder and hiding the original as a backup. This keeps our base colors safe while we work. From there, I'll add new layers above each plane specifically for lights and shadows. It's actually pretty straightforward from here. You just have to be mindful of the contrast for each plane. Starting with the background, I'm keeping the shadows subtle. I'm essentially using a value that's only slightly darker than the base color. To avoid it looking flat, I've turned down my brush opacity. This lets me build up the shadow gradually, adding texture and depth without making it look too heavy or solid. It's easy to get lost in the details here, so don't be afraid to pull up your references. They'll help you see exactly how light hits those foreground elements and keep your textures grounded in reality, rather than just guessing. For the middle ground, I'm pushing the contrast to highlight the focal point. I'll use a bluish tone for the shadows to reflect the sky and contrast with the warm base colors. Setting the layer to multiply helps these cool shadows blend naturally, deepening the values without making them look muddy. Now, to really bring the focal point to life, I'm switching to textured brushes to break up the solid shapes. Since this is the focal point, those extra bits of texture help draw the eye in and keep the viewer engaged. Finally, I'll add an overlay layer on top of the middle ground. Using a soft, light color, I'll gently paint in some highlights. This adds that extra bit of dimension and sparkle, making the cottage and surrounding trees feel truly three-dimensional and lit by the sun. For the foreground, the goal is subtlety. Since it's closest to the viewer, it can easily overpower the focal point if we make it too busy. So, like the background, I'm focusing on subtle value variations rather than sharp contrasts. That said, because it's in the front, you can see more detail here than in the distance, just not as much as the cottage. Think of it as soft detail. Enough texture to show proximity, but kept muted so the eye still travels back to the middle ground. Finally, we've reached the last step: details and final touches. Since we've already used textured brushes throughout the painting, there isn't much heavy polishing to do. Instead, this stage is mostly about refining edges and adding variety where needed. For example, the cottage roof looked a bit plain, so I'm going in with a textured brush to break it up. Here's a quick shortcut for getting clean, sharp edges on complex shapes. First, use the line tool to draw a solid rectangle. Then, lock transparent pixels on that layer and swipe your textured brush across it. Finally, use Free Transform to mold that shape perfectly to the roof's perspective. For the other elements, I'm just adding subtle, hazy effects to soften any harsh lines and unify the scene. And yeah, that's pretty much my process. It's not perfect, but it's what helped me actually get through more pieces. I still change things depending on what I'm drawing, but having this kind of starting point makes a big difference. We basically just kept things simple the whole way through, starting loose, figuring out the values first, then slowly building up color, light, and a bit of detail at the end. If you try it out, I'd love to see what you make. And again, big thanks to Clip Studio Paint for sponsoring this video. If you want to try it out, I'll leave a link in the description.